Wow, thank you. Thank you guys so much for being here tonight. It's such a pleasure to be here at the Philosophical Research Society, such a pleasure to be in Los Angeles. I truly love this city, and I love the energy that's present here at this center. We just had a wonderful session that went on for several hours in the library where somebody brought their dog. How nice. What is the dog's name? That's the second dog that we've had here today, actually. I was doing several hours of tarot readings after our event in the library, and there was a woman who brought her dog into the tarot reading, which I thought was very nice. And we took a picture of me and the dog, so watch for that. It's really been a pleasure. We had a lovely talk and session about tarot and other esoteric topics in the library, and then everybody who attended received 3-card readings. And that was just an extraordinary experience. So I'm coming off of the experience of having done about 2 hours of tarot cards back to back. And we'll see what kind of energy that produces in me. I feel very good to be here. The theme of tonight's talk is, of course, Hermes Resurrected, and asks the question, does ancient Hermetic spirituality, which is to say late Egyptian Greek spirituality, hold relevance, hold a practical path, hold concrete exercises and techniques for the contemporary seeker? And for me, the answer to that question has been a powerful and resounding yes. And my interest in Hermetic spirituality has reawakened over the past 2 years, and it's been a topic that I've been speaking about with increasing frequency, and it's a subject to which I'm very deeply dedicated, and I think it's opening up in our generation in a unique and powerful way. And I'd like to take a step back. Hi, dog. Do you want to come up? Go ahead. He looks, very tentative and deeply intelligent. It's a subject that's very personal to me, and I'd like to lead into it in a very personal way. There was a great esoteric spiritual teacher who was the father-in-law of a dear and very powerful friend of mine who died. And he had, over the course of his life, amassed just an extraordinary library of esoteric and mystical literature, spanning all the traditions, spanning across all geography and all time. And his daughter and his son-in-law, both of whom were teachers and senior colleagues and guides to me, they were clearing out his library, which was in the borough of the Bronx in New York City. And myself and a few other people were coming to lend a hand with the cleaning out of this vast spiritual, mystical, esoteric library. And the different books were being put into boxes, and the boxes were being labeled. One box might say Catholicism, another might say Kabbalah or Judaism, another might say Hinduism, another might say Sikhism. And there was this one box of books tucked away into the corner of the library that said occult books. And my friend could see that I had my eye on this, and my eye kept darting to it. And all this material was being packed up in order to be given to antique dealers or other libraries, other places. So they were organizing this, and they were really trying to get this job done. And my friend observed that, I kept, with this sort of salivating look in my eyes, looking at this box marked occult books. And he said to me, "Look, I know you have your eye on that box, so I'll make a deal with you. You stay here for the rest of the day, and help me get this task done, and I will allow you to take that box home with you. So I said, oh boy, so I did, and I helped. And a friend was driving me home, and he was an Aikido instructor, and I could see that he too was very interested in what would be inside of this box. And, he told me once I got back home with it and opened it up to call him and to let him know. So, I carry the box up to my apartment, and I'm so excited. And I open it up, and I discover that somebody had mislabeled the box. And inside, there were books from venerated traditions like Eastern Orthodoxy and Sufism and Hinduism, and I was so disappointed. And I called my friend, and I said, these aren't occult books. These are from actual traditions. What am I supposed to do with this material? And he and I would joke about that for years thereafter. I felt so deeply defrauded. And of course, I was being humorous, but within humor, there's always a great deal of truth. And one of the truths for me is that I have always found occultism and, frankly, religious novelty and ideas that might be written off as not being sufficiently serious enough to warrant study as being really magical doorways to a whole spectrum of ideas. I have benefited tremendously, for example, from studying disreputable subjects like the Ouija board and seances and spiritualism, because I find that these topics open up onto a very broad spectrum of ideas and possibilities. I opened my first book, Occult America, up with the story of having been a little kid, 9 years old, at a diner in Queens, the Silver Moon Diner, which is still there. And there was a machine at the diner that dispensed these little horoscope star scrolls, which cost a dime, and they were your monthly horoscope. You got a little horoscope for each day of the month, rolled up and packed tightly into this little clear plastic tube, and you could take it out and unroll it and read your horoscope. And I remember at age 9 being absolutely enchanted with this, and that was one of the things that set me on my own journey as a seeker, as a historian of the occult. I wanted to know, where did this come from? This material, whether you like it or dislike it, take it seriously or dismiss it, it came from someplace. The glyphs of the planets, the associations of the zodiac signs, all these things were grounded in something very, very ancient that had somehow come to this 9-year-old kid in the borough of Queens at a diner one Sunday morning. And I take those experiences very, very seriously, because I do believe that sometimes we need novel or popular or dramatic doorways that can open up into something profoundly serious and profoundly meaningful. And I continue to have these experiences even well into adulthood. And I had one such experience back in 2017, and it was a rediscovery of a book that at one time I did not take very seriously, but I came to a different perspective on it. And it's a book that some of you may know, probably that a number of you here have read. It is an occult book from 1908 called the Kabbalion. That's attributed to 3 initiates. And years ago, I had read this book, the Kabbalion, which purports to be a commentary on an ancient lost book of Hermetic wisdom. And I'll get to a definition of Hermeticism a little bit later. But it purports to be this commentary on a lost ancient book of Hermetic wisdom, and these mysterious 3 initiates are making available to the 20th century reader these lost maxims and sayings and expressions from the distant Hermetic past, and demonstrating ways that these things can be applied in the here and now. and bringing to bear psychological principles and steps and insights onto this ancient wisdom. And I must tell you, about 20 years ago, when I read the book for the first time, I dismissed it. I thought, look, this is just a good old-fashioned American metaphysics, mind causality, positive thinking, new thought, kind of dressed up in Egyptian garb, like Elizabeth Taylor dressed up as Cleopatra, on the set of a movie somewhere. And I wasn't particularly interested in the historiography of the three initiates. I thought people, and I continue to think actually, people just made too much drama, of that online. And I was interested in it more from an anthropological perspective or more from a historical perspective as just an interesting bit of early 20th century occultism, a novelty, an occult novelty, which took contemporary American metaphysics and sort of dressed it up in Egyptian pageantry. I didn't think much more of it, quite frankly. But the book kept coming to my attention again and again and again. And there was a religious scholar who said to me at one point, I would give you his name, but we were having a private discussion, and some people are more shy than I am about their affinity for disreputable topics. But he said to me with a kind of gleam in his eye, there are some very good ideas in that little book. And I thought, that was interesting, because he was a very critically minded guy. And the book kind of kept coming to my attention again and again and again. And I sometimes reapproach or re-enter an idea just because of an oddball story or an oddball series of coincidences that brings something back to my attention. And I'll share one such story with you about the Kabbalion. And this is a very Los Angeles story. It came to my attention that this book, the Kabbalion, was a favorite book of a very great comedic actor who everyone in this room will instantly recognize, Sherman Hemsley, who played the great George Jefferson on The Jeffersons. Someone told me that this book was actually something that was held in veneration by Sherman Hemsley, and he thought that his whole career and his whole life underwent a pivot point, a turning point, when he discovered the Kabbalion. And my friend Philip Deslip, who's a great scholar, shared with me, sure enough, an article from TV Guide magazine, that great esoteric journal, from 1982, which had a very beautiful painting of Sherman Hemsley on the cover. And the headline was, Sherman Hemsley, Inside His Secret Life. And I thought, his secret life? And I turn into the article, and the headline inside is, Sherman Hemsley, You'll Never Believe How He Lives or What He Believes In. And I'm reading this article, and the reporter begins to say that Sherman is this guy who is very interested in meditation and Kabbalah and mysticism, and is this very serious guy, and that his whole life was turned around by a mysterious book. And Sherman tells the reporter, one day I met the man with the book, and it changed everything for me. And the reporter asked him, what book was it? And Sherman, in kind of George Jefferson style, mumbled, I don't want to advertise any book. But his housemate, Andre Pavone, who also spoke to the reporter, later confirmed to him that it was the Kabbalion, and that Sherman said to him, man, you've got to read it. And the reporter asked Sherman Hemsley, who had a reputation as being a private guy, why he didn't frequent Hollywood parties or restaurants. And Sherman said to him, nothing goes on there. Everything that matters goes on in the mind. And the article went on to talk about his dedication to meditation and mysticism, and how he had given away copies of this book, the Kabbalion, to friends, and felt that it had done everything for him. And I have entered into a lot of different ideas just because an individual's story or testimony or experience, doesn't matter whether they're famous or not famous, whatever walk of life they come from, testified to the effectiveness of something. Because we live in a world where people are marketing stuff to us all the time. And what is more refreshing, what is more persuasive than just hearing earnest testimony from one individual? And sometimes that's enough to return me to something. And this story about this actor who I grew up loving, and a show that I felt very attached to when I was a kid, returned me to this book, the Kabbalion. And I was on vacation in the summer of 2017 on Hilton Head Island. And I brought only one book with me, and that was the Kabbalion. And I reread the book consecutively 5 times. And my ex-wife said of me, "You're like Walter White. Once you get into something, you just go all the way. There's no halfway." And that summer was this wonderful, revealing time to me where I read this book through, a book that I had previously dismissed or hadn't taken very seriously. And suddenly it was speaking to me with this new relevancy. And I came to realize, as I read the book with significant care, that not only was it populated with a spiritual psychology that was profoundly insightful, not only did it reconcile many questions that run through contemporary iterations of metaphysics and mysticism, but I was delighted to discover that it really is an authentic retention of certain ideas from ancient Hermetic spirituality, and that the religious scholar who said to me with a kind of twinkle in his eye, "You know, there are some very good ideas in that little book," was actually putting me on a scent trail, and a scent trail that I was very happy not to have ignored. And I'm pleased to say that, it was funny. I was invited to speak at a conference on Gnosticism at Rice University last spring, and I gave a talk on the retention of Gnostic and Hermetic ideas in contemporary spiritual life, and spoke specifically about the Kabbalion as one of 3 such examples. The other 2 were the work of Edgar Cayce and the work of a mystic named Neville Goddard, who I admire very deeply. And that talk is being included in a collection that's coming out from the academic publisher Brill in July of this year. And I was thrilled to be able to revisit the Kabbalion in such a way that not only did I derive things from it personally, which I'll tell you about, but I was able to reframe the book in such a way that I think really gave it its proper due. Because I was wrong when I first read it and saw it as just a novelty of early 20th century occultism. Yes, it may be that. It may be that. And there's nothing wrong with a novelty. But it was also a genuine retention of ideas that grew out of the Hermetic experience. And I want to talk about what Hermeticism really is and what it can hold for us contemporary seekers today. One very often hears the term Hermetic. It's used as a term to connote mystery. It's used as a term to connote arcane or esoteric or occult spiritual ideas. But it does actually have a very plain and concrete meaning. And this is what it is. In the late stages of ancient Egypt. The nation's ruling class, really more or less by force, was Hellenic in nature, primarily Greek, but also Roman. And earlier I referenced Elizabeth Taylor playing Cleopatra somewhat humorously, but the fact is, Cleopatra and the rulers that followed her in the wake of Alexander the Great, the Hellenic conqueror general, became the rulers of ancient Egypt in its final stages. And the seat of their rulership was in the city of Alexandria in the centuries just preceding Christ. The city of Alexandria, of course named after the conqueror Alexander the Great, became the seat of Hellenic Greco-Roman power in Egypt. And the Hellenic rulers of Egypt had a mixed record. Some of them, who were known as Ptolemies, this being the title of general in Alexander's army, were really just there as colonizers, and they were just there to pillage the country, strip it of its resources, ship it back home, and didn't really care very much about Egyptian culture one way or the other. Other leaders, including Cleopatra, were actually very deeply and profoundly dedicated to Egyptian culture. And Cleopatra, in her day, was a deeply venerated leader among the ancient Egyptians, specifically because she was a deep believer in the religious and mythical and ethical philosophies of Egyptian tradition, and she did a great deal to reverse the decline of religion and tradition and the temple order and the mystery religions of ancient Egypt, and she spent a great deal of money and personal clout reviving the priesthoods, the temple orders, the initiatory rites, the schools. So Cleopatra, although she was Greek, was viewed by the Egyptian people as a kind of divine figure, as a savior. She was not unlike Queen Elizabeth many centuries later, who was called the Divine Elizabeth or Diva. There was a cult around Queen Elizabeth because she too was seen, particularly among people with radical religious beliefs, as a protector, a patron, a savior, an enlightened figure who permitted, at least by the standards of the day, religious experimentation, who was religiously actually quite liberal and very promoting of culture and experiment and learning. Cleopatra was viewed very much in the same light by the Egyptians. And this is why Egypt's reversal, Egypt's decline as a center of commerce and culture was reversed under the reign of Cleopatra. And Alexandria became a city of great learning and cosmopolitanism. Now, thanks in part to the influence of Cleopatra, but predating her as well, learned Greeks who came into contact with Egyptian culture particularly venerated Egypt's god of wisdom and writing and intellect, Thoth. Thoth is a figure that some of you will recognize from hieroglyphs and bas reliefs. He was a god with the head of an ibis, or a water bird. The ancient Egyptians venerated the water bird because they viewed it as a creature who could span all the different spheres of existence. It was at home in all the different elements, the element of water, the element of earth, and the element of air. So the ibis and other water birds were considered among the most sacred of animals. And so Thoth, the Egyptian god of intellect, was depicted with the head of an ibis and was often depicted in profile holding a stylus or a writing instrument. And Thoth was the patron of teachers, of artists, of writers, of any who worked in fields of design or beauty or intellect. And the ancient Greeks, in encountering this figure of Thoth, held him in such veneration that they described him as being 3 times as great as their own god of intellect, Hermes. And they used the Greek phrase Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes. You can find Greek inscriptions that say, Thoth is great, 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 thrice as great as Hermes. So the phrase Hermes Trismegistus came to be used by Egyptian Greeks who wanted to elevate Thoth above their own god of intellect and writing. And in the centuries, really the decades immediately following the death of Christ, there grew a cluster of Greek Egyptian intellectuals in the city of Alexandria who began to write down ancient Egyptian philosophy in the Greek language. And they very often affixed the byline Hermes to this writing, or Hermes Trismegistus. And this came to be known as the Hermetic literature. And this was extraordinarily important because this was in the final stages of Egypt as an empire, as the ancient civilization that we associate with the great monuments and the pantheon of gods and pyramids and so on. And the Egyptians, of course, in hieroglyphs had a pictogrammatic language, had a symbolical language, but their tradition was more of a tradition that encrypted its ideas in oral passage of stories and mythology, and in architecture and in symbol. The Greek language was a more expository language, and so the Greeks began to write down Egyptian oral traditions and passion plays and initiatory stories into the Greek language, and as was common in antiquity, as was common, people would sometimes affix the name of a mythical figure like Moses or Abraham onto a manuscript to give it additional gravitas, additional weight, additional clout. So these Greek Egyptian intellects in Alexandria, in writing down Egyptian philosophy, would very often affix the name Hermes or Hermes Trismegistus onto this literature. Now, this literature was written largely in Greek, sometimes in Arabic, sometimes in Aramaic. And eventually, as the Roman Empire and the Greek Hellenic world broke apart and Egypt fell into economic ruin and a certain degree of chaos, this literature was largely lost and forgotten. But there persisted the rumor, a correct rumor, that there had been written down somewhere these magical manuscripts that preserved Egyptian thought from its golden age. And as Europe passed through centuries known as the Dark Ages, some of the ancient literature from the Hellenic, Egyptian, Persian, and Babylonian world was preserved. in monasteries, in underground libraries, that somehow survived the march of time, survived the chaos that we associate with the period called the Dark Ages, which was one of plague and disorganization and warfare, interrupted, of course, by periods of relative peace, but a period of time that was considered disorderly. And as the period known as the Renaissance began to develop in Florence, Italy, there was a remarkable occurrence that brought the Hermetic literature back to light. And it occurred this way. In or around the year 1460, there was a Byzantine monk who appeared in the court of the Florentine leader, Cosimo de' Medici. And he came bearing 17 scrolls that contained manuscripts signed by Hermes, or Hermes Trismegistus. And Cosimo and his court translators and intellects believed that this was possibly the most significant discovery since the manuscripts of Plato, and that they felt that these legendary lost scrolls of magical ideas of early ancient Egyptian primeval philosophy had suddenly come to light, And Cosimo de' Medici commanded his court translator, Marcello Ficino, to stop translating the work of Plato from Greek into Latin. Latin was still the language that was used by the learned classes, and to instead turn his attention to these Hermetic manuscripts and to translate these Hermetic manuscripts from ancient Greek into Renaissance-era Latin. Now, the Renaissance mind was ignited with this idea that somewhere back in the distant past, before Judaism, before Christianity, there existed this primeval theology, this pristine early theology from which everything else grew, from which everything else sprang. And they felt that the Hermetic literature was just that. It was a time capsule of this ancient Egyptian philosophy that predated everything else. It was a primary theology. And these manuscripts, as they came to light, became hugely influential across the world of the Renaissance for about 150 years. And I'll describe something about what was in these manuscripts, but another historical note is first necessary. You might be asking yourself, wow, this is great. So we in the West have possession of these ancient Egyptian scrolls, right? So let's get to it. This is great. This beautiful, pristine, ancient Egyptian theology was rediscovered in the Renaissance and was translated into Latin, and the Latin was presumably translated into English. Well, what are we waiting for? Let's get to it. Why don't I know about this? The reason you don't know about this, or I don't know about this, or people are not reading much in the way of translated Hermetic literature, is because I think due to a mistake in binary human thinking, one of the great fissures of human nature, these manuscripts at the end of the Renaissance fell into disrepute. But it was a mistaken disrepute, and it occurred in the following way. Renaissance intellects had pinned great hopes onto the Hermetic manuscripts. They hoped and they wished that these manuscripts were a kind of time capsule, as I was saying, that preserved the oldest, earliest, most pristine theology. And they felt that the figure of Hermes Trismegistus may in fact have even been a real figure and may have been a contemporary of Moses or a contemporary of Abraham and was a real mythical, spiritual guide who had written down these ideas. And there was a critic named Isaac Casaubon, who published a treatise in 1614, the year of his death, analyzing the timeline of the Hermetic literature. And in his analysis, he demonstrated that due to certain linguistic styles, verbiage, references, manners of usage of language, the Hermetic literature did not date back to oldest antiquity, but in fact had been written down in late antiquity in the decades immediately following the death of Christ. Once the timeline had been correctly readjusted as to when this material was written down, in the generations ensuing, people came around, especially with the dawn of the so-called Age of Enlightenment, to the hasty and mistaken conclusion that the entire Hermetic project had been compromised. Because the hopes of antiquity were dashed, many scholars and translators and critics came to feel that the Hermetic literature itself was a kind of hoax or a fraud or a mistake or a kind of vanquished ideal. But what was not properly understood, and this is one of the reasons why this literature has been neglected, although that is slowly reversing itself today, what was not understood is that just because something was written down in late antiquity does not mean that it was just thought of at that time. It didn't just happen to fall from the sky in the decades following Christ. It is part of the fundamental story of human philosophy across every civilization, every culture, that ideas begin as part of the oral tradition. They are encrypted in ritual, in myth, in play, and in oral transmission. And it is only later that they are written down. This is true in the works of Homer. This is true in the works of Plato. This is true in the great ancient Egyptian, Persian, and Babylonian works as well. And it is only in our very generation, and I write about this in my paper that's coming out in July, it's only in our generation that scholars and critics and academics are just beginning to come around to the understanding that the Hermetic literature has correspondences with deepest Egyptian antiquity. Yes, it was written down in the decades following Christ. Yes. But it came from a source that was much older than that, specifically oral tradition, the initiatory rites of the mystery religions, and symbol and myth. This is why there aren't more really good quality English translations of the Hermetic literature. That too is slowly changing. That too is slowly changing. Now, I have encountered 3 really quality English translations. One was done privately, and I wish it were available to the general public, but it's currently not. Another was published by Cambridge University Press by a guy named Brian Copenhagen. And another was recently published by the press Inner Traditions. It has a variety of translators, but the first one listed is Clement Salomon. Clement Salomon. The Copenhagen and the Salomon translations are probably, in all honesty, the first decent translations into English of the Hermetic literature that we have. That's how severely neglected it has been. That is how severely neglected this literature has been. And I believe you will find, if you explore this literature in good translations and in conjunction with other of your studies, that it represents an extraordinary and beautiful opening and flowering of ancient Egyptian ideas that are available to us today and that actually do correspond with some of the ideas that have currency in our own contemporary mystical and esoteric cultures. They are not part of a direct family tree because history is very, very messy. Things get interrupted, things get waylaid, things vanish only to reappear generations later. I often say there are very, very few straight lines in history. There are a lot of squiggly lines, there are a lot of messy lines, and there are a lot of lines with interruptions and eraser marks in them. But for all that, you can find retentions between certain ideas that animated the religious imagination of ancient Egyptian people and certain ideas that we work with today. So let me get into some specifics of what exists within the Hermetic literature and why it may prove a help in your own search in the here and now. The primary central idea that you will find in the Hermetic manuscripts, and I'm speaking specifically of the 17 manuscripts that make up what is called the Corpus Hermeticum. These were the 17 manuscripts that this Byzantine monk in 1460 walked into the court of Cosimo de' Medici bearing. That's their antiquity. And then there's one additional book called Asclepius, which is available to us. We only have Latin copies of it, but there are fragments of it in ancient Greek, so it's also considered part of the Corpus Hermeticum. So we're really talking about 18 very short books that are commonly considered to be the Hermetic literature. There are other tracts. I want to be very clear about that. This is all very fluid. But when we talk about the Hermetic literature, we're basically talking about 18 very short books, all of which are available in the translations that I previously mentioned. The central idea that you'll find in Hermeticism, the central idea is that all of life, everything that we function within, springs from this one great eternal mind, which the Hermetic philosophers referred to as nous, like a great overmind. Ralph Waldo Emerson called it the oversoul. Emanuel Swedenborg called it the divine influx. He spoke of there being this great spiritual sun whose rays and whose cosmic laws permeated all of us. Sometimes people will use the term infinite mind or overmind, but the Hermeticists again and again referred to this idea of nous, this great umbrella mind, this all-creative overmind. The world, the universe, the cosmos, your life, your psychology is the product of a great intellect, a great presence, a great thinking stuff that permeates the cosmos. And the Hermetic philosophers taught that you, the individual, are crafted in the image of this great overmind. The central maxim of one of the pieces of Hermetic literature, known as the Emerald Tablet, which is not included in the traditional collection, but has eventually come to be recognized as an authentic piece of ancient Hermetic literature. The Emerald Tablet states the great principle, as above, so below. As above, so below. It reads, true without falsehood, certain and most true. That which is above is as that which is below. And all springs from the meditation of the One. The first English translation of the Emerald Tablet was written by the great scientist Isaac Newton, who is seen as the father of traditional mechanical physics, is seen as one of the leading voices of the Age of Enlightenment. And yet Newton, as some of you know, had a very deep-seated interest in alchemical and hermetic and occult ideas, and he was deeply inspired by the Emerald Tablet. This phrase, as above, so below, sounds so simple, and yet if you live with it, and if you keep it as your ever-present companion, it can be this great reconciling idea. Everything in the Hermetic cosmology is seen as a kind of concentric circle emanating from Nous, from the One, from the great Overmind. And the properties possessed by this great Overmind are reflected in its creation. So, following the principle of as above, so below, which in Western scripture is rendered, God created man in his own image, a more narrow iteration of that principle, I think. Following from the logic of that principle, you the individual, have causative, creative capacities innate within your own intellect, innate within the picturizing function of your own mind. And the Hermetic literature spells this out very deeply and very plainly. Book 11 of the Hermetic literature is very specific about this. It talks about how through the imagination, you, the individual, can visit all places, can know all things, can become as one with the gods. Book 11 emphasizes the idea that through meditation, you must realize your own infinitude, your own limitless dimensions, your own potential freedom from parameters of worldly existence. And yet, the Hermetic literature also cautions, and you'll see this in the Kabbalion as well, and I think this is very helpful and very reconciling of all these ideas, that the individual also is conscripted to live within a limiting cosmic and physical framework, so that we do not, in terms of the concentric circle that we occupy in the here and now, possess ultimate freedom. We will experience physical decline. We do not experience immortality. We will experience decline. We will experience mortality. But through processes of awareness, and the Hermetic literature talks about eternal recurrence, through processes of awareness, the individual is capable of rising up higher and higher through these concentric circles of existence, so that he or she progressively can get closer to the great mind that is the source of everything. But regardless, even within the limited framework that we occupy, our minds are like tiny capillaries of nous and can create, not only in a cognitive motor sense, but in a literal and actual sense. This is the promise of the Hermetic literature. And one might be apt to say, well, gee, that sounds a lot like some of our contemporary psycho-spiritual ideas. And there is truth to that. There is truth to that. Not because the architects of those ideas were reading the Hermetic literature, because, as I said, there have been tragically few decent English translations, and for a long time there was such a paucity of translations that you probably couldn't even find any in the United States through much of the 19th century. But the fact is, I do believe that deeply seeking people are capable of, and in fact must come to similar conclusions about the ultimate nature of life. We find this across all kinds of cultures and civilizations, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in large. It's peculiar, the number 13 is considered an omen across all kinds of different cultures. In ancient Hindu culture, it's considered bad luck to have 13 people seated around a banquet table. In ancient Nordic culture, the god Loki, the god of mischief, is the 13th man at a banquet of the gods, which ends in destruction and catastrophe. In Christianity, Judas Iscariot is seen as the 13th guest at the Last Supper. Why should Mediterranean Christianity, ancient Vedic philosophy and mythology, and Nordic mythology all have a fixation on the number 13? I have no idea. But it's just one small example of how even ideas that seem tantalizingly folkloric or occult can reoccur remarkably across different cultures and civilizations. So not only am I not surprised when correspondences occur in philosophical ideas, but I would say it's almost a given that correspondences have to occur in philosophical ideas. So my wish for everybody seated in this room is that you encompass within your search this Hermetic literature, because it will place you in touch with our initiatory ancestors from very, very deep antiquity, who you will be astounded to discover had certain ideas that seem tantalizingly similar to some of our own. And I think these ideas can provide a kind of reconciling illumination to some of the things that we struggle with. For example, why, if we abide by the principle that thoughts are causative, do we bump up against so many contradictions? Why are there physical difficulties? Why do we deal sometimes with chronic pain or diseases? Are we doing something wrong? I don't prescribe to that at all. My contention has always been that we live under many laws and forces. And you'll discover the same idea in the Hermetic literature, that yes, you have this expansive sacred power of mental creation, but you have to understand, so say the Hermeticists, that you can only exercise that power within the circle of physicality and cosmology that you occupy. It's incomplete. Your epicness, your largeness as a being is in process. So say the Hermetic manuscripts. If you want to immerse yourself in this literature, I recommend this as a doorway. Get yourself a decent translation of the Corpus Hermeticum. I've named two. One is the Cambridge University Press translation by Brian Copenhagen, which is really quite wonderful, and the other is the Inner Traditions translation by Clement Salmon and others. The primary books to read in those translations are the following. Book 1, which is called The Divine Pymander of Hermes Trismegistus. Book 11, which really talks about the potentials and the capacities of mind metaphysics, and the book that's known as Asclepius, which is sort of in addition to the Hermetic corpus that has a dialogue between Hermes and his son Asclepius that also expands on some of this mind metaphysics material. And also, hand in hand with reading this literature, read or return to the Kabbalion, because the Kabbalion is a wonderful psychological distillation of some of these ideas. I want to return to that book for a moment. It's attributed, as I said earlier, to 3 initiates, and people love debating online who are the 3 initiates, and people seem persuaded that one of them was the occultist Paul Foster Case, and there are all kinds of theories that go on. The fact is, I and some of my colleagues have really done the forensics on it, and the book was written by William Walker Atkinson, the great New Thought intellect who was so active in the early 20th century. It was published by William Walker Atkinson's Chicago-based publishing company, the Yogi Publication Society. Atkinson was an extraordinarily energetic intellect who often wrote under pseudonyms. He wrote under the pseudonym Yogi Ramasharka. He wrote under the pseudonym Theron Q. Dumont. And he wrote under the pseudonym Magus Incognito, which I think was his dumbest pseudonym. And of course, he was most successful writing under the pseudonym 3 Initiates. I think he adopted the term 3 Initiates simply because he was trying to bring an air of mystery to the book. There are also 3 primary initiates that appear in the Hermetic literature, and they are Asclepius, Tat, which is a shortened version of the name Thoth, and Amen. Asclepius, Tat, and Amen are the 3 initiates who are often being addressed by the god figure Hermes in the Hermetic literature. So he may have been adapting those 3 names as an inspiration behind 3 initiates. The name Kabbalion has no actual meaning, but it may be an attempt to bring a Hellenic sounding to the term Kabbalah. It's possible. Atkinson tended to market and promote his books through a certain degree of drama, which, as I was saying, could make it seem easy not to take them very seriously. But that would be a mistake. That would be a mistake, because he was a hugely shrewd observer of human nature, and he very doggedly and carefully read and parsed what English translations existed of the Hermetic literature in the Victorian and late Victorian age. One of the translations was written by a very brilliant man named G.R.S. Mead, who was a secretary to Madame H.P. Blavatsky, the great occultist and the co-founder of the Theosophical Society. Now, G.R.S. Mead's translations, which are available free online, are very turgid and they're very tough to get through. But they are legitimate source material, and Atkinson kind of pieced together whatever sources he was capable of. And he distilled some ideas from the Hermetic literature that I think are really valid and really valuable and really worth working with. And I want to name a couple of them. One of the ideas that Atkinson distilled in the Kabbalion is the concept that everything in life is a polarity. Everything differs only by degree. Hot and cold differ by degree. Ethical concepts like good and evil differ by degree. Emotional states like depression and exuberance differ by degree. And he reasons in the book that you can actually, and I urge you to experiment with this, you can actually translate one mood into another through intense focus and meditation on the desired state, provided you have identified the correct sliding scale of polarity. In other words, he believed that, for example, hate can translate into love. Love can translate into hate. And in fact, any sensitive observer will tell you that this occurs all the time. This occurs all the time. Yes, think about your ex, right? You did love him, and in fact, it's not uncommon that emotional states are always traveling back and forth between polarities. It's been observed. I don't know who this originated with. It's attributed to everybody from, Napoleon to Alan Alda, that comedy is tragedy plus time. But I take it to be true. I'm sure it was Napoleon who said that. Napoleon said everything. There was some guy with a quill following him, on the battlefield, writing down everything. Every plan immediately fails upon contact with the enemy, and it is actually true, of course. Most of the things that we laugh at in life are some sort of tragedy seen in the light of perspective, and it exposes us to something absurd in the human experience. You can see examples of polarities, I think, everywhere you look. And you find this inherent within the Kabbalion, and you'll see this actually within ancient Egyptian monuments, where differing polarities are often positioned together, positioned with one another. There's this ancient idea that everything that is created from an active and a passive force coming into contact, and a reconciling force emerges from the two. So Atkinson makes the case, I think, in a very, very intriguing fashion, that if you're experiencing an unwelcome emotion, you can, through focus on its opposing state, actually move your emotional experience across a sliding scale and come to the opposite place. So, boredom can be translated into engagement or enthrallment. Hate can be translated into love. Courage or fear can be translated into courage. Anxiety can be translated into confidence. And the trick of it, he writes, the trick of it is that you just have to identify correctly whatever the opposite polarity is that you want to get to, because both states are part of the same whole. That's the secret. Because life is composed of affirming and negating forces, they aren't opposites. They're one whole. They're one whole, which gives you the possibility of reaching that opposing but in kind same state and experiencing something different. Another Hermetic concept that Atkinson talks about in the Kabbalion is the concept of rhythm, that all of life, as with the natural world, is an inevitable ebb and flow. Everything that transpires must be part of an ebb and flow. Goethe made the observation that days often go in cycles, and I've experienced this myself almost with uncanny accuracy, that good and bad days seem to follow interchangeably. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his great essay, Compensation, made the case that every swing in the direction of the negative is compensated by an equal and opposite swing in the direction of the positive. This was what Atkinson was trying to get across with his concept of rhythm. And he made the case that if you could elevate your thoughts to a place of observation, you could actually temper or negate the pendulum swing from one place to another. So in other words, if you go through a wonderful experience, let's say you win some sort of award or accolade or something, it could be argued that from a psychological perspective, as above, so below, reflecting the flow of tides, reflecting the revolutions of the cosmos and of our own planet, the pendulum is going to swing in some equal and opposite direction, and you'll experience something perhaps undesired. But his contention was that if you can elevate your psyche to a state of observation, to a state of awareness, that that's the natural order of things, you can escape the emotional pull. You can gain perspective in such a way that keeps you from experiencing the full emotional trauma of the pendulum swing going to the other place. It has to do with very, very sharp observation. He doesn't provide many really concrete hands-on methods in the Kabbalion because he says, I want to give you the principles and you yourself have to work out some of your own techniques because you will more fully enter those techniques if you work them out for yourself. And I don't think he was being cheap in doing that because let me tell you, Atkinson was unbelievably prolific and energetic. If he felt like it, he could have provided techniques that, would have kept you busy until, today, starting in 1908. But he made the concerted decision, and this is one of the reasons why the book bears repeat readings. He made the concerted decision that you had to work out the techniques yourself. So some of what I'm describing to you is me working out some of these own techniques for myself. Some of these ideas may work for you, or you may need to come up with your own approaches. He talked about cause and effect in the book, and how nothing is really the result of coincidence or accident, because everything follows from a series of causative factors. And you have to watch life very, very carefully to try to determine these causative factors and figure out whether there's something that you can do to influence them. He talks about a concept of mental gender, by which he really means, and there's precedent for this in the Hermetic literature, by which he really means that you can use your conscious mind, or what might be considered the affirming principle, to impregnate your subconscious mind, or what might be considered the passive principle, with an idea. You must not get caught up in thinking somehow affirming is good and passive is bad, or affirming is strong and passive is weak. That's not true at all. Passive is fertile. Passive is the womb. Passive receives. Passive is a volcano from which a great eruption, a reconciling force emanates. So it's not a question of putting some sort of a good or bad, weak or strong label on these things. It's above all that. And his concept of mental gender is that you can use your conscious thoughts. You must use them. You must wield them and guard them with great care because they are impregnating your subconscious, the passive force, and resulting in this reconciling force. Now, there are so many wonderful, wonderful ideas in the Kabbalion that I want to encourage you to give this book multiple readings hand in hand with some of the Hermetic literature, particularly the three books I've mentioned. Book 1, or The Divine Pymander of Hermes Trismegistus. Book number 11, which is filled with some of the finest psychological ideas. And Asclepius. And I want to add something else to the mix. I want to challenge you to do something. And now I'm going to get very weird. But it's going to be weird in a way that's going to help you. Because what I'm going to share right now, frankly, it could be a great source of help to some of you sitting in this very room. It could prove to be a turning point in your life. I do believe in my heart and in my intellect that we must experiment fully and completely with the insights of the ancients. Yes, there's psychological value in the ancient myths and parables. Yes, we love and admire their architecture, their geometry, their ethics, their calendric systems. We marvel at the monolithic structures that they left behind them. We encrypt the beautiful pyramid and the eye of infinity on the back of our dollar bill. We marvel at the beautiful symbolic languages and ceremonies and initiatory traditions that they possessed. I think it also behooves us to remember that the ancients also viewed these mythical figures, Thoth, Hermes, Hermes Trismegistus, Mercury, as real deific figures to whom petitions could be made. And in my personal search and in my personal experience, I have found that the proclivity of the ancients to personify primeval energies and to bestow upon these primeval energies names like Thoth and Set and Sekhmet and Hermes, I think were done based on a very, very deep knowledge and understanding of nature and the cosmos and the workings of life in ways that are much larger and profound than we contemporary people commonly realize. And the challenge that I issue to you is this: in addition to your study of the Hermetic literature, I personally do believe that deific help is available to contemporary men and women. And if what I am saying resonates with you, and if the figure of Hermes or Mercury or Thoth pulls at something in you that feels familiar, that feels reassuring, that feels alluring, it's my contention that you should experiment with that, and you should issue a prayer or a petition to one of these ancient deific figures and see what happens. See what happens. Because I do believe that help is available. You know, when we talk about mind causation and the uses of the mind and the uses of positive thought and mind metaphysics, it can all seem like a cruel joke sometimes, because some of us, in fact all of us at certain times, are crushed by the stresses of life. We experience addictions, we experience tragedies, we experience episodes of terrible grief where we feel just forced to our knees, and we're not able to use our minds in all these constructive ways that are prescribed in the Kabbalion and other places. And I honestly don't think that Mother Nature played a cruel joke on us, whereby we were given all these exercises, but they were placed out of reach when we feel most burdened by the stresses and difficulties of life. I don't think a cruel joke was played on us. I do think that deific help is available. And I have this suspicion. You can call it poetic if you want, or you can just say, well, you know, Horowitz has gone nuts and leave it at that. But I have this suspicion that the ancient gods are lonely, and they want our veneration, and they hunger for our veneration. And it really could be that if some of the figures I'm describing or some of the ideas that I'm describing speak to you in an intimate or in an appealing way, it really could be that you could make tonight a very personal petition to one of these figures and find yourself in an extraordinary relationship as the disciples of Hermes found themselves in the Hermetic literature when Ammon, Tat, and Asclepius found themselves spoken to by this extraordinary deific figure who bestowed upon them ideas and methods and possibilities and hope. I've often thought that these ancient personifications of primeval energy if they have intellect, then they also have emotions. And I think they're lonely. I think they're lonely. And it can fall to you. It can fall to you today to approach them personally, in private. Ask for something. You all have needs in your heart. Ask for something. See what happens. Have we lost our taste for experimental religion? You don't have to tell anybody what you're doing. They can think I'm the crazy one. You just go ahead and do it and see what happens. One of the most moving parts of the Hermetic literature, and one of the parts of this literature that will give you pause when you read it, is that the great Hermetic book Asclepius foresees, prophesizes Egypt's decline. And at one point Hermes says, "Oh, Egypt, Egypt, there will be left of thy religion only fables." But the same book also prophesizes the resurrection of Hermes, the resurrection of the ancient gods. And I believe that prophecy is true too. And that resurrection can take place in your own heart this very night. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.